All right. Okay, welcome to the Cultured Bumpkin. All you cultured bumpkins. This is chapter 13 of Sense and Sensibility. So I think I missed chapter 9. I was looking through some stuff. I think I went like 1 through 8 and then I missed 9. But anyway, we'll come back and do that one probably at the end when I'm done. But right now I'm, you know, on a roll or whatever. So that is, we'll, I'll check on chapter 9. Either way, tonight we're going to start with chapter 13. So whether you're live or catching the replay, welcome. I hope that you enjoy this as much as I do reading it. Chapter 13. Their intended excursion to Whitwell turned out very different from what Eleanor had expected. She was prepared to be wet through, fatigued, and frightened, but the event was still more unfortunate, for they did not go at all. By 10 o'clock, the whole party was assembled at the park, where they were to breakfast. The morning was rather favorable, though it had rained all night, as the clouds were then dispersing across the sky, and the sun frequently appeared. They were all in high spirits and good humor, eager to be happy, and determined to submit to the greatest inconveniences and hardships rather than to be otherwise. When they were at breakfast, the letters were brought in. Among the rest, there was one for Colonel Brandon. He took it, looked at the direction, changed color, and immediately left the room. "What's the matter with Brandon?" said Sir John. Nobody could tell. "I hope he has no bad news," said Lady Middleton. "It must be something extraordinary that could make Colonel Brandon leave my breakfast table so suddenly." In about 5 minutes he returned. "No bad news, Colonel, I hope," said Mrs. Jennings as soon as he entered the room. "None at all, ma'am, thank you." "Was it from Avignon? I hope Was it from Avignon? I hope it is not to say that your sister's worse." "No, ma'am, it came from town. It's merely a letter of business." But how came the hand to discompose you so much, if it was only a letter of business? Come, this won't do, Colonel. Let's hear the truth of it." "My dear madam," said Lady Middleton, "recollect what you were saying." "Perhaps it's to tell you that your cousin Fanny is married," said Mrs. Jennings, without attending to her daughter's reproof. "No, indeed it is not." "Well, then, I know who it's from, Colonel, and I hope she's well." "Whom do you mean, ma'am?" he said, coloring a little. "Oh, you know who I mean." I'm particularly sorry, ma'am," he said, addressing Lady Middleton, "that I should receive this letter today, for it's on business that requires my immediate attendance in town." "In town?" cried Mrs. Jennings. "What can you have to do in town this time of year?" "My own loss is great," he continued, "in being obliged to leave so agreeable a party. But I'm the more concerned, as I fear my presence is necessary to gain your admittance at Whitewell." What a blow upon them all was this. What a blow upon them all was this. "But if you write a note to the housekeeper, Mr. Brandon," said Marianne eagerly, "will it not be sufficient?" He shook his head. "We must go," said Sir John. "It shall not be put off when we're so near it. You cannot go to town till tomorrow, Brandon, that's all." "I wish it could be so easily settled, but it's not in my power to delay my journey for one day." "If you would but let us know what your business is," said Mrs. Jennings, "we might see whether it could be put off or not." "You would not be 6 hours later," said Willoughby, "if you were to defer your journey till I return." "I cannot afford to lose 1 hour." Eleanor then heard Willoughby say in a low voice to Marianne, "There are some people who can't bear a party of pleasure. Brandon is one of 'em. He was afraid of catching cold, I dare say, and invented this trick for getting out of it. I'd lay 50 guineas the letter was of his own writing." "I have no doubt of it," replied Marianne. "There's no persuading you to change your mind, Brandon, I know of old," said Sir John. Once you're determined on anything, But, however, I hope you'll think better of it. Consider here are two Miss Carries come over from Newton. The three Miss the three Miss Dashwoods walked up from the cottage, and Mr. Willoughby got up 2 hours before his usual time on purpose to go to Whitewell. Colonel Brandon again repeated his sorrow at being the cause of disappointing the party, but at the same time declared it to be unavoidable. Well, then, when will you come back? I shall hope we I hope we shall see you at Barton, added her ladyship, as soon as you can conveniently leave town, and we must put off the party to Whitewell till your return. You're very obliging, but it's so uncertain when I may have in my power to return that I dare not engage for it at all. Oh, he must and shall come back, cried Sir John. If not here by the end of the week, I shall go after him. I do so, Sir John, cried Mrs. Jennings. Then perhaps you may find out what his business is. I don't want to pry into other men's business. I suppose it's something he's ashamed of. Colonel Brandon's horses were announced. You need not go to town on horseback, do you? Added Sir John. No, only to Honiton. I shall then go post. Well, as you're resolved to go, I wish you a good journey, but you'd better change your mind. I assure you it's not in my power. He then took leave of the whole party. Is there no chance of my seeing you and your sisters in town this winter, Miss Dashwood? I'm afraid none at all. Then I must bid you farewell for a longer time than I should wish to. To Marianne, that was Brandon, sorry. So he then took leave of the whole party. Is there no chance of my seeing you and your sisters in town this winter, Miss Dashwood? I'm afraid none at all. Then I must bid you farewell for a longer time than I should wish to. To Marianne he merely bowed and said nothing. Come, Colonel, said Mrs. Jennings, before you go, do let us know what you're going about. He wished her a good morning, and attended by Sir John left the room. The complaints and lamentations which politeness had hitherto restrained now burst forth universally, and they all agreed again and again how provoking it was to be so disappointed. I can guess what his business is, however, said Mrs. Jennings exultantly. Can you, ma'am? Said almost everybody. Yes, it's about Miss Williams, I am sure. And who is Miss Williams? Asked Marianne. What? Do not you know who Miss Williams is? I'm sure you must have heard of her before. She's a relation of the Colonel's, my dear, a very near relation. We'll not say how near for fear of shocking the young ladies. Then, lowering her voice a little, said to Eleanor, She's his natural daughter. Indeed. Oh, yes, and as like him as she can stare. I dare say the Colonel will leave her all his fortune. When Sir John returned, he most heartily joined in the general regret on so unfortunate an event, concluding, however, by observing that as they were all got together, they must do something by way of being happy. And after some consultation, it was agreed that although happiness could not be enjoyed at Whitewell, they might procure a tolerable composure of mind by driving about the country. The carriages were then ordered. Willoughby's was first, and Marianne never looked happier than when she got into it. He drove through the park very fast, and they were soon out of sight, and nothing more was seen of them till their return, which did not happen till after the return of all the rest. They both seemed delighted with their drive, but said only in general terms that they had kept in the lanes while the others went on the downs. It was settled there that there should be a dance in the evening, and that everybody should be extremely merry all day long. Some more of the Careys came to dinner, and they had the pleasure of sitting down nearly 20 to table, which Sir John observed with great contentment. Willoughby took his usual place between the two elder Miss Dashwoods. Mrs. Jennings sat on Eleanor's right hand. And they had not been long seated before she leaned behind her and Willoughby, and said to Marianne, loud enough for both of them to hear, I found you out in spite of all your tricks. I know where you spent the morning. Mary Ann colored and replied very hastily. Where, pray? Do not you know, said Willoughby, that we had been out in my curricle? Yes, yes, Mr. Imprudence, I know that very well, and I was determined to find out where you'd been to. I hope you like your house, Miss Marianne. It's a very large one, I know, and when I come to see you, I hope you will have it furnished, for it wanted very much when I was there 6 years ago. Marianne turned away in great confusion. Mrs. Jennings laughed heartily, and Eleanor found that in her resolution to know where they had been, she had actually made her own woman inquire of Mr. Willoughby's groom, and that she had by that method been informed that they had gone to Allenham and spent a considerable time there walking about the garden and going all over the house. Eleanor could hardly believe this to be true, as it seemed very unlikely that Willoughby should propose or Marianne consent to enter the house while Mrs. Smith was in it, with whom Marianne had not the smallest acquaintance. As soon as they left the dining-room, Eleanor inquired of her about it, and great was her surprise when she found that every circumstance related by Mrs. Jennings was perfectly true. Marianne was quite angry with her for doubting it. Why should you imagine, Eleanor, that we did not go there, or that we did not see the house? Is it not that you often wish to do so yourself? Yes, Marianne, but I would not go while Mrs. Smith was there, and with no other companion than Mr. Willoughby. Mr. Willoughby, however, is the only person who can have a right to show that house, and as he went in an open carriage, it was impossible to have any other companion. I never spent a pleasanter morning in all my life. I'm afraid, replied Eleanor, that the pleasantness of an employment does not always evince its propriety. On the contrary, nothing can be a stronger proof of it, Eleanor, for if there had been any real impropriety in what I did, I would have been sensible of it at that time, for we always know when we're acting wrong, and with such a conviction I could have had no pleasure. But, my dear Marianne, as it has already exposed you to some very impertinent remarks, do you not now begin to doubt the discretion of your own conduct? If the impertinent remarks of Mrs. Jennings are to be the proof of impropriety in conduct, we are all offended every moment of our lives. I value not her censure any more than I should do her commendation. I'm not sensible of having done anything wrong in walking over Mrs. Smith's grounds or in seeing her house. They will one day be Mr. Willoughby's, and if they were one day to be your own, Marianne, you would not be justified in what you've done. She blushed at this hint, but it was even visibly gratifying to her, and after a 10 minutes' interval of earnest thought, she came to her sister again and said with great good humor, Perhaps, Eleanor, it was rather ill-judged in me to go to Allenham, but Mr. Willoughby wanted particularly to show me the place, and it's a charming house, I assure you. There's one remarkably pretty sitting-room upstairs, of a nice comfortable size for constant use, and with modern furniture it would be delightful. It's a corner room, and has windows on two sides. On one you look across the bowling green behind the house to a beautiful hanging wood, and on the other you have a view of the church and village, and beyond them of those fine bold hills that we have so often admired. I did not see it to advantage, for nothing could be more forlorn than the furniture. But if it were newly fitted up, a couple of £100, Willoughby says, would make one of the pleasantest summer rooms in England. Could Eleanor have listened to her without interruption from the others, she would have described every room in the house with equal delight. And that was chapter 13. So, I'm just going to not use those. Let's see how long chapter 14 is. Chapter 14. The sudden termination of Colonel Brandon's visit at the park, with his steadiness in concealing its cause, filled the mind and raised the wonder of Mrs. Jennings for 2 or 3 days. She was a great wonderer, as everyone who must be as every one must be who takes a very lively interest in all the comings and goings of all their acquaintance. She wondered with little intermission what could be the reason of it, and was sure there must be some bad news, and thought over every kind of distress that could have befallen him with a fixed determination that he should not escape them all. "Something very melancholy must be the matter, I am sure," said she. "I could see it in his face, poor man. I'm afraid his countenance may be bad. The estate at Delaford was never reckoned more than 2,000 a year, and his brother left everything sadly involved. I do think he must have been sent for about money matters, for what else can it be? I wonder whether it's I wonder whether it's so. I'd give anything to know the truth of it. Perhaps it's about Miss Williams, and by the by, I dare say it is, because he looked so conscious when I mentioned her. Maybe she's ill in town. Nothing in the world more likely, for I have a notion she's always rather sickly. I would lay any wager that it's about Miss Williams. It's not so very likely that he'd be distressed in the circumstances now, for he's a very prudent man, and to be sure must have cleared the estate by this time. I wonder what it can be. May his sisters Maybe his sister is worse at Avignon and has maybe his sister is worse at Avignon and has sent for him. His setting off in such a hurry seems very like it. Well, I wish him out of all his troubles with my heart, and a good wife into the bargain." So wondered, so talked Mrs. Jennings. Her opinion varied with every fresh conjecture, and all seeming equally probable as they arose. Eleanor, though she felt really interested in the welfare of Colonel Brandon, could not bestow all the wonder on his going so suddenly away, which Mrs. Jennings was desirous of her feeling. For besides that, the circumstance did not, in her opinion, justify such lasting amazement or variety of speculation. Her wonder was otherwise disposed of. It was engrossed by the extraordinary silence of her sister and Willoughby on the subject, which they know which they must know to be which they must know to be peculiarly interesting to them all. As this silence continued, every day made it appear more strange and more incompatible with the disposition of both. Why they should not openly acknowledge to her mother and herself what their constant behavior to each other declared to have taken place, Eleanor could not imagine. She could easily conceive that marriage might not be immediately in their power, for though Willoughby was independent, there was no reason to believe him rich. His estate had been rated by Sir John at about 600 or 700 a year, but he lived at an expense to which that income could hardly be equal, and he had himself often complained of his poverty. But for this strange kind of secrecy maintained by them relative to their engagement, which in fact concealed nothing at all, she could not account, and it was so wholly contradictory to their general opinions and practice that a doubt sometimes entered her mind of their being really engaged, and this doubt was enough to prevent her making any more inquiry of Marianne. Nothing could be more expressive of attachment to them all than Willoughby's behavior. To Marianne, it had all the distinguishing tenderness which a lover's heart could give, and to the rest of the family, it was the affectionate attention of a son and a brother. The cottage seemed to be considered and loved by him as his home. Many more of his hours were spent there than at Allenham, and if no general engagement collected them at the park, the exercise which called him out in the morning was almost certain of ending there, where the rest of the day was spent by himself at the side of Marianne and by his favorite pointer at her feet. One evening in particular, about a week after Colonel Brandon left the country, his heart seemed more than usually open to feeling every attachment to the objects around him. And on Mrs. Dashwood's happening to mention her design of improving the cottage in the spring, he warmly opposed every alteration of the place which affection had established as perfect with him. "What!" he exclaimed. "Improve this cottage? No, that I will never consent to. Not a stone must be added to its walls, not an inch to its size, if my feelings are regarded." "Do not be alarmed," said Miss Dashwood. Nothing of the kind will be done, for my mother will never have money enough to attempt it. I'm heartily glad of it, he cried. May she always be poor if she can employ her riches no better. Thank you, Willoughby, but you may be assured that I would not sacrifice one sentiment of local attachment of yours or of any one whom I loved for all the improvements in the world. Depend upon it, depend upon it that whatever unemployed sum may remain, when I when I make up my accounts in the spring, I would I would even rather lay it uselessly by than dispose of it in a manner so painful to you. But are you really so attached to this place as to see no defect in it? I am, he said. To me, it's faultless. Nay, more, I consider it as the only form of building in which happiness is attainable. And were I rich enough, I would instantly pull comb down and build it up again in the exact plan of this cottage. With dark, narrow stairs and a kitchen that smokes, I suppose? Said Eleanor. Yes, he cried in the same eager tone, with all and everything belonging to it, in no one convenience or inconvenience about it should have the least variation be perceptible. Then and then only, under such a roof, I might perhaps be as happy at Combs as I've been at Barton. I flatter myself, replied Eleanor, that even under the disadvantage of better rooms and a broader staircase, you'll hereafter find your own house as faultless as you now do this. There are certainly circumstances, said Willoughby, which might greatly endear it to me, but this place will always have one claim on my affection, which none other can possibly share. Mrs. Dashwood looked with pleasure at Marianne, whose fine eyes were fixed so expressively on Willoughby as plainly denoted how well she understood him. How often did I wish, he added, when I was at Allenham this 12-month, that Barton Cottage were inhabited. I never passed within view of it without admiring its situation and grieving that no one should live in it. How little did I think that the very first news I should hear from Mrs. Smith, when next I came into the country, would be that Barton Cottage was taken, and I felt an immediate satisfaction and interest in the event, but nothing but such a kind, which nothing but a kind of prescience and but nothing but a kind of prescience of what happiness I should experience from it can account for. Must it not have been so, Marianne? Speaking to her in a lowered voice. Then continuing his former tone, he said, and yet this, must it not have been so, Marianne? Speaking to her in a lowered voice. Then continuing his former tone, he said, and yet this house you would spoil, Miss Dashwood? You would rob it of its simplicity by imaginary improvement? And this dear parlor, in which our acquaintance first began, and in which so many happy hours have been since spent to, and which so many happy hours have since spent by a, in which so many hours have since been spent by us together, you would degrade to the condition of a common entrance, and everybody would be eager to pass through the room which was hitherto attained with itself with more real accommodation and comfort than any other apartment of the handsomest dimensions in the world that could more accommodation and comfort than any apartment of the handsomest dimensions in the world could possibly afford. Mrs. Dashwood again assured him that no alteration of the kind. Mrs. Dashwood again assured him that no alteration of the kind should be attempted. You're a good woman, he warmly replied. Your promise makes me easy. Extend it a little farther, and it'll make me happy. Tell me that not only your house will remain the same, but that I shall ever find you and yours as unchanged as your dwelling, and that you'll always consider me with the kindness which has made everything belonging to you so dear to me. The promise was readily given, and Willoughby's behavior during the whole of the evening declared at once his affection and happiness. Shall we see you tomorrow to dinner? Said Mrs. Dashwood when he was leaving him. I don't ask you to come in the morning, for I do not ask you to come in the morning, for we must walk to the park to call on Lady Middleton. He engaged to be with him by 4 o'clock. That was chapter 14. So this will be chapter 15. Hope you all are doing well. I I just posted Anne of Green Gables in Southern and are in what do you call it? Pride and Prejudice and Persuasion are already up in audiobook form on the channel, so you can check those out if you like. If you like the audiobook, this is, they say never watch laws or sausage being made. I would add, don't watch audiobooks either. But if you want to watch laws being made, you can watch C-SPAN. If you want to watch sausages being made, you can. I don't know. I don't know about that one. But if you want to watch audiobooks being made, you can tune in here. And then I'll edit them and stick them back up where they don't have all the mistakes in it. Anywho, but thank you very much, whether you are watching live or catching the replay at some later date. Thank you for watching. Chapter 15. Mrs. Dashwood's visit to Lady Middleton took place the next day, and 2 of her daughters went with her. But Marianne excused herself from being of the party under some trifling pretext of enjoyment, and her mother, who concluded that a promise had been made by Willoughby the night before of calling on her while they were absent, was perfectly satisfied with her remaining at home. On their return from the park, they found Willoughby's curricle and servant in the waiting at the cottage, and Mrs. Dashwood was convinced that her conjecture had been just. So far it was all she had foreseen, but on entering the house she beheld what no foresight had taught her to expect. They were no sooner in the passage than Marianne came hastily out of the parlor, apparently in violent affliction, with her handkerchief at her eyes, and without noticing them ran upstairs. Surprised and alarmed, they proceeded directly into the room she had just quitted, where they found only Willoughby, who was leaning against the mantelpiece with his back towards them. He turned around on their coming in, and his countenance showed that he strongly partook of the emotion which overpowered Marianne. "Is there anything the matter with her?" cried Mrs. Dashwood as she entered. "Is she ill?" "I hope not," he replied, trying to look cheerful, with a forced smile presently added, "It's I who may rather expect to be ill, for I now suffer under a very heavy disappointment." "Disappointment?" "Yes, I'm unable to keep my engagement with you. Mrs. Smith has this morning exercised the privilege of riches upon a poor dependent cousin by sending me on business to London. I've just received my dispatches and taken my farewell of Allenham, and by way of exhilaration, I am now come to take my farewell of you." "To London? And you're going this morning?" "Almost this moment." "This is very unfortunate, but Mrs. Smith must be obliged, and her business will not detain you from us long, I hope." He colored as he replied, "You're very kind, but I have no idea of returning into Devonshire immediately. My visits to Mrs. Smith are never repeated within the 12-month. And is Mrs. Smith your only friend? Is Allenham the only house in the neighborhood to which you'll be welcome? For shame, Willoughby, can you wait for an invitation there?" His color increased, and with his eyes fixed on the ground, he only replied, "You're too good." Mrs. Dashwood looked at Eleanor with surprise. Eleanor felt equal amazement. For a few moments, every one was silent. Mrs. Dashwood first spoke. I have only to add, my dear Willoughby, that at Barton Cottage you will always be welcome, for I'll not press you to return here immediately, because only you can judge how far that might be, because you only can judge how far that might be pleasing to Mrs. Smith, and on this head I shall be no more disposed to question your judgment than to doubt your inclination." "My engagements at present," replied Willoughby confusedly, "are of such a nature that I dare not flatter myself—" He stopped. Mrs. Dashwood was too much astonished to speak, and another pause succeeded. This was broken by Willoughby, who said with a faint smile, "It is folly to linger in this manner. I'll not torment myself any longer by remaining among friends whose society it's impossible for me now to enjoy." He then hastily took leave of them all and left the room. Then they saw him step into his carriage, and in a minute he was out of sight. Mrs. Dashwood felt too much for speech, and instantly quitted the parlor to give way in solitude to the concern and alarm which this sudden departure occasioned. Eleanor's uneasiness was at least equal to her mother's. She thought of what had just passed with anxiety and distrust. Willoughby's behavior in taking leave of him, his embarrassment and affectation of cheerfulness, and above all, his unwillingness to accept her mother's invitation, a backwardness so unlike a lover, so unlike himself, greatly disturbed her. One moment she feared that no serious design had ever been formed on his side, and the next that some unfortunate quarrel had taken place between him and his sister. The distress in which Marianne had quitted the room was such as a serious quarrel could most reasonably accounted for, though when she considered what Marianne's love for him was, a quarrel seemed almost impossible. Quick break. Hey, Jennifer. Hope you're having a good evening. But whatever might be the particulars of their separation, her sister's affliction was indubitable, and she thought with the tenderest compassion of that violent sorrow which Marianne was in all probability not merely given way to as a relief, but feeding and encouraging as a duty. In about half an hour her mother returned, and though her eyes were red, her countenance was not uncheerful. "Our dear Willoughby is now some miles from Barton, Eleanor," she said, as she sat down to work, "and with how heavy a heart does he travel? It's all very strange, so suddenly to be gone. It seems but the work of a moment. And last night he was with us so happy, so cheerful, so affectionate. And now, after only 10 minutes' notice, gone too without intending to return. Something more than what he owned to us must have happened. He didn't speak. He didn't behave like himself. You must have seen the difference as well as I. What can it be? Can they have quarreled? Why else should he have shown such unwillingness to accept your invitation here? It was not inclination that he wanted, Eleanor. I could plainly see that. He had not the power of accepting it. I have thought it all over, I assure you. I can perfectly account for everything that at first seemed strange to me as well as to you." "Can you indeed?" "Yes, I have explained it to myself in the most satisfactory way. But you, Eleanor, who love to doubt where you can, it will not satisfy you, I know. But you must not talk me out of my trust in it. I'm persuaded that Mrs. Smith suspects his regard for Marianne, disapproves of it, perhaps because she has other views for him, and on that account is eager to get him away, and on that business which she sends him off to transact is invented as an excuse to dismiss him. This is what I believe to have happened. He is moreover aware that she does disapprove the connection. He dares not, therefore, at present, confess to her his engagement with Marianne, and he feels himself obliged, from his dependent situation, to give in to her schemes, and absent himself from Devonshire for a while. You'll tell me, I know, that this may or may not have happened, but I will listen to no cavil unless you can point out any other method of understanding the affair as satisfactory as this. And now, Eleanor, what can you have to say?" "Nothing, for you have anticipated my answer." Then you would have told me that it might or might not have happened." "Oh, Eleanor, how incomprehensible are your feelings! You had rather take evil upon credit than good. You had rather look out for misery for Marianne and guilt for poor Willoughby than an apology for the latter. You resolved to think him blamable because he took leave of us with less affection than his usual behavior has shown. And is no allowance to be made for inadvertence or for spirits depressed by recent disappointment? Are no probabilities to be accepted merely because they're not certainties? Is nothing due to the man whom we have all so much reason to love, and no reason in the world to think ill of? To the possibility of motives unanswerable in themselves, though unavoidably secret for a while? And after all, what is it you suspect him of? I can hardly tell myself, but suspicion of something unpleasant is the inevitable consequence of such an alteration as we just witnessed in him. There's great truth, however, in what you have in what you have just now in what you have now urged of the allowances which ought to be made for him, and it's my wish to be candid in my judgment of everybody. Willoughby may undoubtedly have very sufficient reasons for his conduct, and I will hope that he has, but it would have been more like Willoughby to acknowledge them at once. Secrecy may be advisable, but still I cannot help wondering at its being practiced by him. Do not blame him, however, for departing from his character where the deviation is necessary. But you really do admit the justice of what I have said in his defense? But you really do admit the justice of what I have said in his defense? I'm happy, and he's acquitted. Not entirely. It may be proper to conceal their engagement, if they are engaged, from Mrs. Smith, and if that is the case, it must be highly expedient for Willoughby to be but little in Devonshire at present. But this is no excuse for their concealing it from us. Concealing it from us, my dear child? Do you accuse Willoughby and Marianne of concealment? This is strange indeed, when your eyes have been reproaching them every day for incautiousness. I want no proof of their affection, said Eleanor, but of their engagement I do. I'm perfectly satisfied of both. Yet not a syllable has been said to you on the subject by either of them. I've not wanted syllables where actions have spoken so plainly. Has not his behavior to Marianne and to all of us, for at least the last fortnight, declared that he loved and considered her his future wife, and that he felt for us the attachment of the nearest relation? Have we not perfectly understood each other? Has not my consent been asked daily by his looks, his manner, his attentive and affectionate respect? My Eleanor, is it possible to doubt their engagement? How could such a thought occur to you? How is it to be supposed that Willoughby, persuaded as he must be of your sister's love, should leave her, and leave her perhaps for months without telling her of his affection, that they should part without a mutual exchange of confidence? I confess, replied Eleanor, that every circumstance except one is in favor of their engagement. But that one is the total silence of both on the subject, and with me it almost outweighs every other. How strange this is! You must think wretchedly indeed of Willoughby, if, after all that has openly passed between them, you can doubt the nature of the terms on which they're together. Has he been acting a part in his behavior to your sister all this time? Do you suppose him really indifferent to her? No, I can't think that. He must and does love her, I'm sure. But with a strange kind of tenderness, if he can leave her with such indifference, such carelessness of the future as you attribute to him. You must remember, my dear mother, that I've never considered this matter as certain. I've had my doubts, I confess, but they're fainter than they were, and they may soon be entirely done away. If we find they correspond, every fear of mine will be removed. A mighty concession indeed. If you were to see him at the altar, you would suppose they were going to be married. Ungracious girl, but I require no proof of such things. But I require no such proof. Nothing, in my opinion, has ever passed to justify doubt. No secrecy has ever been attempted. All has been uniformly open and unreserved. You can't doubt your sister's wishes. It must be Willoughby, therefore, whom you suspect. But why? Is he not a man of honor and feeling? Has there been any inconsistency on his side to create alarm? Can he be deceitful? I hope not. I believe not, cried Eleanor. I love Willoughby. Sincerely, I love him, and suspicion of his integrity cannot be more painful to yourself than to me. It has been involuntary, and I will not encourage it. I was startled, I confess, by the alteration in his manners this morning. He did not speak like himself. I did not return your kindness with any cordiality. But all this may be explained by such a situation of his affairs as you have supposed. He had just parted from my sister, had seen her leave him in the greatest affliction, and if he felt obliged, from a fear of offending Mrs. Smith, to resist the temptation of returning here soon, and yet aware that by declining your invitation, by saying that he was going away for some time, he should seem to act ungenerous. He should seem to act an ungenerous, suspicious part by our family, be might well embarrassed and disturbed. In such a case, a plain and open avowal of his difficulties would have been more to his honor, I think, as well as more consistent with his general character. But I will not raise objections against anyone's conduct on so illiberal a foundation as a difference in judgment from myself or a deviation from what I think right and consistent. You speak very properly. Willoughby certainly does not deserve to be suspected. Though we have not known him long, he is no stranger in this part of the world. And who has ever spoken to his disadvantage? Had he been in a situation to act independently and marry immediately, it might have been odd that he should leave us without acknowledging everything to me at once, but this is not the case. It's an engagement in some respects not prosperously begun, for their marriage must be at a very uncertain distance, and even secrecy, as far as it can be observed, may now be very advisable. They were interrupted by the entrance of Margaret, and Eleanor was then at liberty to think over the representations of her mother, to acknowledge the probability of many, and hope for the justice of all. They saw nothing of Marianne till dinner time, when she entered the room and took her place at the table without saying a word. Her eyes were red and swollen, and it seemed as if her tears were even then restrained with difficulty. She avoided the looks of them all, could neither eat nor speak, and after some time, on her mother's silently pressing her hand with tender compassion, her small degree of fortitude was quite overcome, and she burst into tears and left the room. This violent oppression of spirits continued the whole evening. She was not without power, because she was without any desire of command over herself. The slightest mention of anything relative to Willoughby overpowered her in an instant, and though her family were most anxiously attentive to her comfort, it was impossible for them, if they spoke at all, to keep clear of every subject which her feelings connected with him. That was chapter 15. Chapter 15. All right. 42. No, I don't know if I want to get into this next or not. 42 minutes is a long time to read, by the way. It's a long without taking a little break. My eyes start getting cross-eyed. I don't think I've done 3 chapters a couple times. I don't think I've ever done 4 on this book yet. Let's see. Well, I'm glad. I'm glad. I'm glad you come in and listen in to these recordings, even though they're not. There's lots of mistakes, but I appreciate you being here, and everyone else as well. Let's see. You know what? I think I'll try for 16. Try for old 16. Chapter 16. Marianne would have thought herself very inexcusable had she been able to sleep at all the first night after parting from Willoughby. She would have been ashamed to look her family in the face the next morning had she not risen from her bed in more need of repose than when she lay down in it. But the feelings which made such composure a disgrace left her in no danger of incurring it. She was awake the whole night, and she wept the greatest part of it. She got up with a headache, was unable to talk, and unwilling to take any nourishment, given pain every moment to her mother and sisters, and forbidden all attempts at consolation from either. Her sensibility was potent enough. When breakfast was over, she walked out by herself and wandered about the village of Allenham, indulging the recollection of past enjoyment and crying over the present reverse for the chief of the morning. The evening passed off in the equal indulgence of feeling. She played over every favorite song that she had used to play to Willoughby, every air in which their voices had been oftenest joined, and sat at the instrument gazing on every line of music that he had written out for her, till her heart was so heavy and that no farther sadness could be gained, and this nourishment of grief was every day applied. She spent whole hours at the pianoforte, alternately singing and crying. Fell over, sorry. She spent she spent whole hours at the pianoforte, alternately singing and crying, her voice often totally suspended by her tears. In books, too, as well as in music, she courted the misery, which a contrast between the past and present was certain of giving. She read nothing but what they had used to read together. Such violence of affliction, indeed, could not be supported forever. It sunk within a few days into a calmer melancholy, but these employments to which she daily recurred, her solitary walks and silent meditations, still produced occasional effusions of sorrow as lively as ever. No letter came from Willoughby, and none seemed expected by Marianne. Her mother was surprised, and Eleanor again became uneasy. But Mrs. Dashwood could find explanations whenever she wanted them, which at least satisfied herself. "Remember, Eleanor," said she, "how often Sir John fetches our letters himself from the post and carries them to it. We have already agreed that secrecy may be necessary, and we must acknowledge that it could not be maintained if their correspondence were to pass through Sir John's hands." Eleanor could not deny the truth of this, and she tried to find it in a motive sufficient for their silence. But there was one method so direct, so simple, and in her opinion so eligible of knowing the real estate of the affair and of instantly removing all mystery, that she could not help suggesting it to her mother. "Why do you not ask Marianne at once," said she, "whether she is or is not engaged to Willoughby? From you, her mother, and so kind, so indulgent a mother, the question could not give offence. It would not be the natural it would be the natural result of your affection for her. She used to be all unreserve, and you more especially." "I would not ask such a question for the world. Supposing it possible they're not engaged, what distress would not such an inquiry inflict? At any rate, it would be most ungenerous. I should never deserve her confidence again after forcing from her a confession of what is meant at present to be unacknowledgeable to anyone. I know Marianne's heart. I know that she dearly loves me, and I shall not be the last to whom the affair is made known when circumstances make the revealment of it eligible. I would not attempt to in, I would not in, I would not attempt to force the confidence of anyone, of a child much less, because a sense of duty would prevent the denial of her wishes, would prevent the denial which her wishes might direct." Eleanor thought this generosity overstrained, considering her sister's youth, and urged the matter farther, but in vain. Common sense, common care, common prudence were all sunk in Mrs. Dashwood's romantic delicacy. It was several days before Willoughby's name was mentioned before Marianne by any of her family. Sir John and Mrs. Jennings, indeed, were not so nice. Their witticisms added pain to many a painful hour. But one evening, Mrs. Dashwood, accidentally taking up a volume of Shakespeare, exclaimed, "We've never finished Hamlet, Marianne. Our dear Willoughby went away before we could get through it. We will put it by that when he comes again, but it may be months, perhaps, before that happens." "No, or months," replied Marianne with strong surprise. "No, nor many weeks." Mrs. Dashwood was sorry for what she had said, but it gave Eleanor a pleasure, as it produced a reply from Marianne so expressive of confidence in Willoughby and knowledge of his intentions. One morning, about a week after his leaving the country, Marianne was prevailed on to join her sisters in their usual walk, instead of wandering away by herself. Hitherto she had carefully avoided every companion in her rambles. If her sisters intended to walk on the downs, she directly stole away toward the lanes. If they talked of the valley, she was as speedy in climbing the hills, and could never be found when the others set off. But at length she was secured by the exertions of Eleanor, who greatly disapproved such continual seclusion. They walked along the road through the valley, and chiefly in silence, for Marianne's mind could not be controlled, and Eleanor, satisfied with gaining one point, would not then attempt more. Beyond the entrance of the valley, where the country, though still rich, was less wild and more open, a long stretch of the road which they had traveled on first coming to Barton lay before them, and on reaching that point, they stopped to look around them and examine a prospect which formed the distance of their view from the cottage from a spot which they had never happened to reach in any of their walks before. Amongst the objects in the scene, they soon discovered an animated one. It was a man on horseback riding towards them. In a few minutes they could distinguish him to be a gentleman, and in a moment afterwards, Marianne rapturously exclaimed, "It is he! It is he indeed! I know it is!" and was hastening to meet him when Eleanor cried out, "Indeed, Marianne, I think you're mistaken. It's not Willoughby. The person's not tall enough for him and has not his air." He has!" cried Marianne. "I'm sure he has. His air, his coat, his horse. I knew how soon he would come." She she walked eagerly as she walked eagerly on as she spoke, and Eleanor, to screen Marianne from particularity, as she felt almost certain of its not being Willoughby, quickened her pace and kept up with her. They were soon within 30 yards of the gentleman. Marianne looked again. Her heart sunk within her, and abruptly turning round, she was hurrying back when the voices of both her sisters were raised to detain her. A third, almost as well known as Willoughby's, joined them in begging her to stop. And and when she turned round with surprise, to see and welcome Edward Ferrars. He was the only person in the world who could at that moment be forgiven for not being Willoughby, the only one who could have gained a smile from her. But she dispersed her tears to smile on him, and in her sister's happiness forgot for a time her own disappointment. He dismounted, and giving his horse to his servant, walked back with him to Barton, whither he was purposely coming to visit him. He was welcomed by them all with great cordiality, but especially Marianne, who showed more warmth of regard in her reception of him than ever, even who showed more warmth of regard in her reception of him than even Eleanor herself. To Marianne, indeed, the meeting between Edward and her sister was but a continuation of that unaccountable coldness which she had often observed at Norland in their mutual behavior. On Edward's side, more particularly, there was a deficiency of all that a lover ought to look and say on such an occasion. He was confused, seemed scarcely sensible of pleasure in seeing him, looked neither rapturous nor gay, said little but what was forced from him by questions, and distinguished Eleanor by no mark of affection. Marianne saw and listened with increasing surprise. She began almost to feel a dislike of Edward, and it ended, as every feeling must end with her, by carrying back her thoughts to Willoughby, whose manners formed a contrast sufficiently striking to those of his brother-elect. After a short silence, which succeeded the first surprise and inquiries of meeting, Marianne asked Edward if he came directly from London. No, he had been in Devonshire a fortnight. A fortnight, she repeated, surprised at his being so long in the same county with Eleanor without seeing her before. He looked rather distressed as he added that he had been staying with some friends near Plymouth. Have you been in Sussex? Have you lately been in Sussex? Said Eleanor. I was at Norland about a month ago. I was at Norland about a month ago. And how does dear, dear Norland look? Replied. And how does dear, dear Norland look? Cried Marianne. Dear, dear Norland, said Eleanor, probably looks as it always does at this time of year, the woods and walks thickly covered with dead leaves. Oh, cried Marianne, with what transporting sensation have I formerly seen them fall! How I've delighted as I walked to see 'em driven in showers about me by the wind! What feelings they have! The season, the air, altogether inspired. No, there is no one to regard 'em. Now there is no one to regard 'em. They are seen only as a nuisance, swept hastily off and driven as much as possible from the sight. It's not every one, said Eleanor, who has your passion for dead leaves. No, my feelings are not often shared, not often understood, but sometimes they are. And as she said this, she sunk into a reverie for a few moments, but rousing herself again, Now, Edward, she said, calling his attention to the prospect, here's Barton Valley. Look up to it and be tranquil if you can. Look up at those hills. Did you ever see their equals? To the left is Barton Park, amongst those woods and plantations. You may have seen the end of the house, and there, beneath that farthest hill, which rises with such grandeur, is our cottage. It is a beautiful country, he replied, but these bottoms must be dirty in winter. How can you think of dirt with such objects before you? Because, replied he, smiling, among the rest among the rest of the objects before me, I see a very dirty lane. How strange, said Marianne to herself as she walked on. Have you an agreeable neighborhood here? Are the Middletons pleasant people? No, not all, answered Marianne. We could not be more unfortunately situated. Marianne, cried her sister, how can you say so? Oh, no, not at all, replied Marianne. We could not be more unfortunately situated. Marianne, cried her sister, how can you say so? How can you be so unjust? They're a very respectable family, Mr. Ferris, and towards us have behaved in the friendliest manner. Have you forgot, Marianne, how many pleasant days we've owed to them? No, said Marianne in a low voice, nor how many painful moments. Eleanor took no notice of this, and directing her attention to their visitor, endeavored to support something like discourse with him by talking of their present residence, its conveniences, etc., exhorting from him occasional questions and remarks. His coldness and reserve mortified her severely. She was vexed and half angry, but resolving to regulate her behavior to him by the past rather than the present, she avoided every appearance of resentment or displeasure, and treated him as though she ought to be treated from the family, and treated him as she thought he ought to be treated from the family connection. Okay, that was chapter 16. Very cool, very cool. All right, well, I think that is where I'm going to end tonight to give my little beady eyes a break, my little tongue a break, stop tripping on words for a little bit. I have to do a couple of voiceovers here in a little bit for a client that are due first thing in the morning, so I'm going to go ahead and knock them out before I go to bed. Jennifer, you are welcome. It's great to see you. And yeah, so thank you very much for watching, whether you're live or catching the replay. Please do subscribe. Please hit the like button if you didn't mind. And hopefully, I will be back here tomorrow night, 9 Central, and we will keep reading. Keep reading Sense and Sensibility. Joy, you're very welcome. Thank you for dropping by. Alrighty, well, y'all have a good night, and I will talk at you later.